Our Old Testament reading for this morning comes to us from the prophet Isaiah, the 40th chapter, verses 21 through 31. You're invited to follow along on page 582 in your pew Bibles. Let's all listen for God's word to us today. Have you not known? Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to live in, who brings princes to naught and makes the rulers of the earth as nothing. Scarcely are they planted, scarcely sown, scarcely has their stem taken root in the earth, when he blows upon them, and they wither, and the tempest carries them off like stubble. To whom then will you compare me, or who is my equal, says the Holy One? Lift up your eyes on high and see, who created these? He who brings out their host and numbers them, calling them all by name, because he is great in strength, mighty in power, not one is missing. Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by my God? Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint and strengthens the powerless. Even youths will faint and be weary, and the young will fall exhausted. But those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I realized this past week that it's been a while since I gave you an update about our dog. I can tell you've been anxious for this. You know about this dog that many days drives me up the wall. You have heard me tell you from this pulpit before about how she likes to dig holes in the backyard, and those holes are many times right around the sprinkler heads themselves, which end up costing us a few $100s in repair at the start of the new spring season. Her latest move is to start barking uncontrollably at random dogs and neighbors while we're on a walk with her. Now, she did not used to do this. She did not do it when she was a puppy. She did not do it when she was 2 years old. But at 4.5 years old, she has decided just to start doing it. Not every dog in person, but random dogs, random people. I never know when it's going to happen. I mean, there was a sermon, I don't know how many years ago it was now, when I just asked y'all, does anybody want a dog? Does anybody want a dog? I'm losing patience with our dog. I mean, I love her. I think I love her, but I'm losing patience with her behavior. You know what I mean? If we just knew that X and Y would change things with our dog, I would feel a lot better. So recently, I took her to the vet to try and address this problem of the straining at the leash when a random dog goes by, and he prescribed some medication for her. Maybe this will calm her down. We've got to wait. We've got to give it some time to work. Don't worry, I'll be letting you know whether or not it works. I think part of the problem, not with her, but with me, is that there doesn't seem to be a finish line to all this. You know what I'm saying? I'm the kind of person who likes a finish line. And perhaps you do as well. How many of you have ever been in the hospital before or had a loved one in the hospital before? Yeah. It can make all the difference in the world when a doctor is not saying to you, we have no idea when you're going to be out of here. But when a doctor says, your loved one will go home tomorrow, sleep in their own bed tomorrow, have a home-cooked meal tomorrow, there's a finish line that you can see. If there are any teachers in this room today, you as a teacher may have the last day of school circled on your calendar. If there are any students in this sanctuary, you may have the last day of school circled on your calendar. It's important, I think, to have finish lines, something we can look forward to. All of which brings me to our text for today. Our text is from the prophet Isaiah. Do you know who Isaiah is writing these words to? Not somebody in the hospital, not a student, not a teacher. He's writing to people in exile in Babylon. More to the point, he's writing to people who could not see the finish line, or perhaps even more so, people who did not know whether or not there would be a finish line. We're in the 40th chapter of Isaiah. The Israelites are in Babylon, and they've been there not just 1 year, not just a few years. Does anybody recall how many years the Israelites spent in Babylon? Over 50 years, over half a century of wondering and waiting and wondering and waiting. Will God deliver us? When will God rescue us? When will God return us to the promised land at last? It's enough wondering and waiting to give up on God. So Isaiah writes, have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He strengthens the powerless. Even youths will faint and be weary, Isaiah writes. And the young will fall exhausted, but those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Did you catch who it was that Isaiah said, will run and not be weary, will walk and not faint? Not those who produce for the Lord, not those who are very active for the Lord, not those who win victory for the Lord, those who wait. Those who wait for the Lord. It is faith as patience. We are continuing our sermon series today, The Fabric of Faith, and that's what we're examining. Faith as patience. Faith as waiting. How many of you are good at patience? Good at waiting. If any of you enjoy it, like it, or feel like you are an expert at it, please see me after worship today. I will hire you $50 an hour to be my personal tutor when it comes to waiting. You see, I am not a fan of waiting, and I would much rather preach a sermon today on how it is unfaithful sometimes to wait. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s words from a Birmingham city jail ring in my ears. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion, King wrote, that our great stumbling block is not the Ku Klux Klan, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who lives by the myth of time and constantly advises us to wait. You see, I'd much rather preach a sermon today about why we cannot wait. In the face of bigotry, in the face of xenophobia, or just unrestrained greed in our country, we cannot wait to stand up for what is right. We cannot wait to address the polarization in our country that tends to rip us apart instead of bringing us together. We need to address these problems now. I would much rather preach that sermon. I find it harder to preach a sermon about waiting. And quite frankly, it has always been this way. It's been this way even before I entered ministry and started preaching sermons. One of my favorite high school teachers, I asked her to write a letter of recommendation for me when I was applying to colleges, and she did. And she had the grace to show me her recommendation. Now, in that recommendation, it also had, please list any areas of weakness, areas of growth for the applicant. You know what she wrote right there? Ben sometimes is a quietly impatient person. Yes, that is still true today. Maybe part of the problem here is that the Bible tells story after story of faith as waiting, faith as patience. Right out of the gates, we get a story about it. How many of you remember Abraham? Okay, how many of you remember Abraham? Good. Do you recall how old Abraham was when God first told him that he would be the father of many nations? 75 years old. 75 years old when God made that promise. How old was Abraham when Isaac, his son, was finally born? 100 years old. What's 100 minus 75? 25. Good. Y'all are math whizzes here in this room. That's 25 years of waiting for God to fulfill God's promise. And yet, it is a remarkable thing. Have you ever seen somebody faithfully wait before? It is a remarkable thing. Next Sunday is the 34th anniversary of Nelson Mandela's release from a South African prison after 27 years of waiting. On February 11th, 1990, it surprised some who watched those remarkable events unfold that Mandela walked from the prison rather than being driven away by car. But it was the act of a patient man. His long walk toward the crowds mirrored his long walk to freedom and that of his people. By walking, he echoed that his freedom would not come without the release of his people. He reiterated the solidarity he had shown throughout the previous decade when he refused to be set free, even though he was offered to be set free, unless his release coincided with political change. In his speech that day, Mandela said, "Our march to freedom is irreversible." He knew that he did not walk alone. He knew that he waited and walked with God. And on the strength of that faith, he reached out to a whole population. Mandela said, "We call on our white compatriots to join us in the shaping of a new South Africa." He described his arch opponent, President F.W. de Klerk, as a man of integrity. Whew. What an extraordinary statement of magnanimity toward a person who, together with his predecessors, had kept Mandela in prison for 10,000 days. How did he demonstrate that kind of grace? Do you think perhaps he learned it in part through waiting? I may not like to wait. You may not like to wait. But waiting may just have something to teach each of us as well, because any one of us can practice it. Any one of us can make waiting and patience a daily practice. I recall the time back in Dallas when I went to visit another pastor in the Presbyterian there. He was retired. He was living in an assisted living facility, and the reason he was there was because he had had a stroke. This once vibrant pastor who had served as the stated clerk of the presbytery, he could no longer speak intelligibly. He could not swallow, and he received nourishment through a feeding tube. It was heartbreaking. But what I saw in his room almost took my breath away. Not the symptoms of the stroke, I mean, who else was there? His wife was in the room. She had health difficulties of her own, but she was there making sure he knew that she was with him. And a member of his former church was sitting there as well. This member was part of a rotating team of members from his former congregation. They would each take turns, sign up for shifts to come in and sit and stay. They could not do much. All they could do is talk to him, hold his hand, sometimes reflect on their memories together. He would not respond. No one knew what kind of difference their presence would make, but they kept showing up day after day, week after week. They trusted that by their presence and by their patience, God would give their former pastor a gift, that God would do something that they could not predict or plan or foresee. How are you with waiting? You see, the question is not whether we like to wait, and it's not whether we will need to wait. The question for the Christian is, how will we do it? Because at some point in each of our lives, life will take an unexpected turn. And when that moment occurs and God is failing to show up in the way that we really wish God would show up, and we are saying, "Hurry up, God." Have you ever said that before? Hurry up, God. How will we wait? Will we get impatient and try to regain control, or will we trust in the goodness and grace of God? Will we trust in God's promise to give us a gift that we cannot predict or plan or foresee? A number of years ago, Jean Jeffrey Geetson wrote a brief essay reminiscing about her father. She said that when she was young, she was very close to her father, and the time that she experienced this closeness the most was when they would have big family gatherings with all the aunts and uncles and cousins there. At some point, someone would pull out the old record player and put on polka records, and the family would dance. Eventually, somebody would put on the beer barrel polka. And when the music of the beer barrel polka played, her father would come up to her, tap her on the shoulder and say, "I believe this is our dance." And Jean would dance with her father. One time, though, when she was a teenager and in a mood, the beer barrel polka began to play. Her father tapped her on the shoulder and said, "I believe this is our dance." She snapped back at him, "Don't touch me. Leave me alone." And her father turned away and did not ask her to dance again. Our relationship was difficult all through my teen years, she wrote. When I would come home late from a date, my father would be sitting in his chair, half asleep, wearing an old bathrobe, and I would snarl at him, "What do you think you're doing?" He would look at me with sad eyes and say, "I was just waiting on you." When I went away to college, I was so glad to get out of his house and get away from him, and for years, she said, I never communicated with him. But as I grew older, I began to miss him. One day, I decided to go to the next family gathering, and when I was there, somebody put on the beer barrel polka. Then, years of inward and outward struggle culminated in the moment when I drew a deep breath, walked over to my father, tapped him on the shoulder, and said, "I believe this is our dance." And he looked at me and he smiled. And he said, "Oh, yes, I've been waiting for you." You see, waiting is not just frustration and it's not just boredom. In the hands of God, it is a gift. It's how we remember our dependence and our trust on the goodness and grace of the living God. How many of you brought your iPhone with you today? How many of you brought you? All right. How many of you keep your calendar on your iPhone? Yeah. How many of you are hoping that I'll wrap this sermon up real soon so that you can keep to your calendar that's there in your iPhone? Don't answer that. Answer this. How many of you brought your trust in the goodness and grace of the living God with you today? Because when you entered this sanctuary, you know what God said to you? Oh, yes, I have been waiting for you. And God promises, no matter what you're waiting on right now, God promises to give you a gift that you cannot predict or plan or foresee. Amen.